Okay, any questions or comments before we start part 2? So part 1 was sort of this general introduction to data viz, and then part 2 is a special focus on storytelling, visualization, and the state of the arts. It's based on a paper. This is the paper. So if you want to actually see the paper, I'll show you how to see it. Because you don't have the slides. I think the paper is probably better than looking at the slides. So you could just put in my name, find computer science, my website, and then publication list. And where is it? Let me do story. So it's 180. Wait, no, that's not it. It's 168. Storytelling and visualization and extended survey. So you can download the PDF and everything there. You can probably just Google the title. Did everybody follow that, or did I go too fast?
Almost.
There's also the link in the tutorial notes.
Oh, good. There's a link in the tutorial notes. So if you have the tutorial notes, you can find the link. Very good. Thank you for that. This is just for the fun of it. This project has a history. It started out with a PhD student of mine called Chao, Tong. And we had this idea to write a survey paper on this topic because it's kind of a trendy topic. And we submitted an outline, a 2-page version, to a conference called Euroviz. Anybody ever heard of Euroviz before? Anyways, it's the main European visualization conference. We submitted our 2-page summary, which is kind of a proposal before you write the whole 30-page document. And then the chairs wrote back to us saying, hey, there's another group that's doing the same thing. Do you want to join together? Which is one of the reasons they ask everybody for a 2-page proposal before you'd write the whole thing. And then we said, yeah, sure, let's join together. They asked the other group the same question, right? And both groups have to agree anonymously beforehand. And then we joined together. So it was me and Chao, and Rita and Richard, and then this other group from China, actually. Both of the submissions were actually rejected from Euroviz, the initial submissions from both groups, and then we worked on it some more. We published it as a conference, a short version, like a 8 to 10 page version at the IVAP conference, and then the full version in the information journal. And for some reason, this information journal version is currently getting lots of citations. See the citations happening a lot these days. That's just for fun. No big information there. One of my friends described the history of one of his papers, and I enjoyed hearing about it so much that I thought, okay, I'm going to start telling a little bit of history too, because you don't see that some papers do not get accepted the first time, right? Has anybody here published papers before? Anybody? So you might have this experience that it doesn't get published the first time, right? Not always. So, okay, so let's talk about the visualization and storytelling. Right, this is a trendy topic right now, visualization and storytelling with data. Right, this is a quote from the editor-in-chief of National Geographic magazine. Has everybody heard of the National Geographic magazine? One of the most famous magazines in the world, probably. It's growing in popularity. Data in its visual representation is used more and more, right, to support understanding and decision-making. And storytelling is a great way to convey visual representations of the data, especially to make them memorable, right? It's something we're all familiar with. Right, and stories are very memorable, generally speaking. Well, they can be if it's a good story, right? So this presentation is based on a survey paper on this topic, right? So sometimes we're referring to this survey paper, and this is the survey paper, the first survey paper of its kind to give an overview of this topic of data visualization, interactive data visualization and storytelling. We provide a novel classification of the literature in this area. And we also provide meta-analysis. In other words, you can compare papers with each other and draw your own some conclusions. And we also offer future work directions, like what are the mature areas, where are the areas where there's a lot of work that's already been done, and what are the areas that are not mature yet and that are unsolved problems. There are lots of unsolved problems in this direction because it's very immature, generally speaking. So we can start off with the definition of storytelling. Anybody know the definition of a story? A story can be defined as a narration of the events in the life of a person or the existence of a thing, or such events as a subject for narration, or a series of events that might be narrated. So does anybody understand that definition? If you look at it carefully, it's really abstract. It's hard to understand, actually. Then the obvious question is, well, what's a narration, or what's a narrative, right? So then you have to look up the definition of narration. What we discovered is there is no universally accepted definition of storytelling and visualization. This is one of the reasons we had such a difficult time publishing the paper in the first place, actually. All the reviewers were coming back to us saying, you don't have a proper definition of storytelling. So there is no agreed definition of visual data story or visualization for storytelling. And there's even a paper just on this topic dedicated to trying to define these terms. We're not going to go into detail about that, but there's a whole paper, research paper, just on trying to provide and uncovering definitions. But the conclusion is still there's no universally accepted definition, right? So what we say here is, it's a series of events, and the connection between those events represented in a visual form. That's kind of our definition. And we'll go into more details and provide different examples and so on. So the community has been using the term storytelling in a very broad way without a clear consensus or discussion on what a visual data story really is. It's a good way to start off things, right? So here's an overview of the literature on this topic. So this is all interactive data visualization literature with a special focus on storytelling. So we made this classification. It's 2 dimensions, and these are these sort of axes, right? We have a who axis, a how axis, and a why on the y-axis. We have literature that focuses on authoring tools and user engagement. which is one of the major reasons, motivations for storytelling. We have narrative visualization, like what does a narrow, how do you visually represent a narrative? The topic of transitions is very common in the storytelling. So you have an event, and it's often represented visually by a node in a graph. And then how do you make a transition from one event to another, right? That's the transitions literature. So there are static transitions where you just hop from one to the next, but there are also animated transitions. So a lot of literature is just focusing on the transitions between events or nodes. Memorability is one of the big motivations behind this topic. So that's the y-axis, right? And look, interpretation, there's no literature about interpretation in this context. So that's an unsolved problem, right? Really unsolved. And then we have on the x-axis the path of the story. So the path can be linear, like one event following another, and it's one-to-one, a one-to-one mapping. One event mapped to the next event, mapped to the next event, right? The simplest story. But then you have other options where the user chooses the path. They have a starting point, then they have multiple options to go which direction should the story go in. And that's the user-directed or interactive path of the story. Then you have stories in parallel, right? You have multiple characters or multiple stories happening all at the same time, right? Just think Lord of the Rings, right? That you have the different paths of the different hobbits, right? You have three groups of hobbits. Has everybody seen Lord of the Rings? Yeah. And then there's a final one, the overview. That just means other literature-based sources of storytelling and visualization, right? Other literature overviews. Any questions about that classification? Yeah?
I have a question about authoring tools. Is
Yes.
it the tools they use to create those
To create the stories,
Okay.
yes. How do you create them in the first place? Yes. Is it like what software can we use? And can we use it a visual piece of software, not just any software? Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions about that? Do the categories make sense, hopefully? And this presentation is actually going through the categories. Actually, I don't go through every single one. It's a 4x4 matrix or something. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if I went through all of them, it would be a long time. We don't go through all of them. We focus on the authoring tools, the narrative, and the transitions. If you want to see everything in the full detail, you have to look at the paper. The presentation would be too long to go through every. I was hoping to go through like maybe visit each cell in the table, but it turns out it would be too long. So I just chose the ones that I think are the most interesting, actually, for this presentation. Now, here's another, this is actually the classification we started with. It's just an alternative classification. It's the same set of papers. And I actually like this one better, but the reviewers wanted to see the other one, the first one. So we rearranged it into the first one, but this is our original one. And the y-axis is very similar, authoring tools, narratives, static transitions, animated transitions, and so on. But the x-axis is different. We have scientific visualization, information visualization, and geospatial visualization. Is anybody familiar with those terms? Information visualization and scientific visualization? Anybody familiar with those? So scientific visualization, simply put, is the visualization of spatial data. So it's data that has a spatial position, position in time and space. So every sample has an XY coordinate or an XYZ coordinate. You can think of like X-rays, for example, or CT scans, or MRI scans. Those are all examples of scientific data, right? You have pictures of the human body, for example. And then information visualization is abstract data. Data that does not have an inherent spatial dimension. Stories don't have an inherent spatial dimension, right? We create a space. Graphs don't necessarily have an inherent spatial dimension, right? And we create the space ourselves. And then, of course, geospace is anything on a map, right? Usually a political map. And here, like you can see, okay, if I'm going to do research in this area, well, a lot of people have done narrative visualization for abstract data. But nobody's really worked on this. So if you were like trying to find unsolved problems, this can help, right? Help you find the more mature areas or the more unsolved areas. And look, there's a lot of unsolved problems here, actually, right? So that's the idea behind the overview, to show you mature areas and unsolved problems. This is a little bit about scope. So we have a lot of related topics here, very closely related. Like you can look at storytelling and virtual reality as a topic. That's its own topic. We don't talk about that here. It's same for augmented reality. You can look at storytelling combined with education. We don't cover that. Multimedia, image processing, language processing, annotation, those are all subjects that we don't cover, but you can combine these. You can combine language processing with storytelling and multimedia with storytelling and so on, right? Why don't we include those? It's because then the scope would be huge. We'd end up with these hundreds of papers, right? And we want to keep it to a manageable level. What we do include are information visualization, scientific visualization, visual analytics, and information visualization. But if you're interested, by the way, if you think, I'm really interested in virtual reality and storytelling, you can go to the PDF, and there's a little section on virtual reality and storytelling, and you can find references in there if you think that part is really interesting. So what does authorship refer to? So these are the tools, software tools that we use to create stories. That's what authorship. So somebody has to write the story, right? Authorship refers to writing or creating a book, article, or document, or the creation of a work of art according to Oxford English Dictionary. So with a special emphasis on the author. Like somebody has to write them in the first place. And then the question also becomes, what's an author? Right? So some of these definitions are very funny because they're not really things we normally think about. Even story, if I say the word story, everybody immediately understands what this word means. I'm going to tell a story. And we don't think about it. But if we try to define it precisely, suddenly it's like, I don't even know what the definition is. Same with author. An author is best described as an individual solely responsible for the creation of a unique body of work. That's a definition from the literature. I mean, in my opinion, you can also include a team, right? Another definition from the literature is story creation involves sequential processes of context definition, information selection, modality selection, and choosing in order to effectively convey the intended narrative. So all the definitions, you can see that they struggle to come up with nice, concise, understandable definitions if you look into the literature on this. Yeah. Luckily, there's no test at the end of this where I say, can you remember the definition of, like, an author? Or should I give a test? So we'll just go through some examples of what this can look like, right, and what the literature looks like. So in this example, the authors are focusing on looking at a volumetric data set. So that's a data set with 3 spatial dimensions, the X, the Y, and the Z, right? That's called volume visualization. It's a special topic in visualization and scientific visualization. And then trying to represent that data in story form, right? And creating a tool that lets us write a story that presents this data. It's pretty abstract, especially if you're seeing this for the first time. So if you can imagine some volume data, and again, a good example to think about, everybody here has been to the hospital, you've got x-rays before, right? X-rays are 2-dimensional projections of volumetric data, but you can get a CT scan, which is a 3-dimensional representation, or an MRI scan. And then imagine that volume changing over time. So it's 4 dimensions. A good example of that is the heartbeat, right? The heartbeat is changing over time. It would be so much fun to get your heart scanned, right, and watch it beating over time, right? And then the question is, how can you represent this visually in a set of static images, for example, using volume rendering? And that's what this paper is about. And these are actual, see, that's a volume here. So that's volumetric data, but it's changing over time. And this happens to be fluid flow, actually, rather than, say, a medical image data set. And what they do is they scan through the time space, they look at all the time steps, and they select the ones that they think are the most important. And they use those very important time steps to create the story, and then create. So the important time steps are the nodes in the story, and then they create transitions between the nodes, right? So to author a story. It's very abstract, especially if you're seeing this for the first time. So nobody here has probably seen volume rendering or volume visualization before. Is that right? Has anybody ever seen that before? So there's an example of what that looks like. It's a 3D volume, and you can see it has structures inside of it, and it's got some semi-transparency, so you can see through the volume. Right? That's volume rendering. And that's an example of linear storytelling. So when you have one node, you have a transition to the next node, and a transition to the next node, and so on. Right? One after the other in sequential order. Here's another example. Again, this is a volume rendering example. It's an authoring tool, but this time the story you put together can be interactive. In other words, the user can decide which path they want to go down, right? And they use a library called the Real-Time Volume Rendering Library, which we don't have time to go into. But that renders the volumetric data very quickly. So that's one of the special properties about this library. And then we have this kind of story creation module, or a subset of the software. And in there we define all the nodes, so the nodes are the events. and we define the transitions between the nodes and the events. And they also can be arranged in hierarchies. So nodes and events can be grouped together to form a hierarchical structure. And then the user can decide which path they want to go down. And depending on which path they go down, they see different views of the data, the volumetric data. Yeah. So this is advanced, by the way. What I'm presenting is advanced, and it might not everything might be understandable. But if you want me to talk about anything in more depth, or just try to explain something more clearly, you can just let me know. Otherwise, I'll go through smooth so we can go to the next exercise, and you can still get an overview, right? And you can still refer back to the paper for those sections that you find really interesting, right? Here's one that I think everybody can understand. It's about the evolution of software and source code. Anybody here write any software before? So 1, 2, 3. And did you use version control when you wrote your software? So that's what this is about, right? So here we have an authoring tool for storytelling or visual representations in parallel. And the image on the right is the history of a software repository, where each line, so the y-axis is representing time, right? It's from the start to the finish. And then each line is representing a source code file, a file in the source code, right? And its history over time. And then the colors are mapped to people, the authors of that source code, right? So we can see the story or the history of this source code as it evolves over time, and we can see them all in parallel, right? So this is an example of an authoring tool for storytelling in parallel. And it also has this feature where anybody can add notes. So if some special event happens, they can add a note to the visualization, the visual representation, and insert some special knowledge, some special events, like a dinner or something, a release party or something like that. And it gives a nice overview of the source code. So that's the authoring tools, a little overview and introduction to the authoring tools. Now we focus a little bit about the narrative, like how do you create or how do you visually represent these stories, right? There are lots and lots of options. So, but what is a narrative, right? Then we tried to get into this definition thing again, and you'll see there's a recurring pattern of fuzzy definitions, fuzzy language, very abstract, but we'll go through it anyways. Narrative structures include events and visualization of characters. So narrative visuals contain the transition between events, right? The narrative visualization involves using a tool to visually analyze data and to generate visualizations via vector graphics or images for presentation, or to decide how to thread the representations into a compelling yet understandable sequence. So the way I think about it as a graph, you define the nodes of the graph, which are the events, the important events in your story, and then the transitions between those events, right? And that visual representation is a narrative on how you tell that story, right? Plomedel report that a narrative specifically refers to the macro structure of a document in contrast to the term story, which refers to both structure and content. The structuring of evidence combined with the choice of appropriate rhetorical strategies is referred to the art of storytelling. So yeah, I'm not going to give you a test at the end to define what a narrative is. But in my mind, I think of it as the visual representation of a story. That's how I think of narrative. So here is an example of a narrative visualization for linear storytelling. This one's a little bit complicated. So the idea here is to create a tool that generates a visual narrative for a news article, actually. So the input is a news article, and then the output is the visual narrative. And it's a little bit complicated, right? So it starts with the input, which is the news corpus, or a large set of news articles, and then a so-called query generator that identifies the most relevant company in an article, and then an so-called annotation selection engine that extracts the important features out of the article, and then generates a graph, which is a visual representation of that news article. So it's a very complicated example, actually. But it's one at least that we can understand in the sense that the input is a news article and the output is a graph, a visual representation, right? And this is a linear process, so you traverse the nodes linearly, so to speak, right? Here's an example of a narrative that is interactive. In other words, the user chooses what to look at, what to focus on, instead of this linear path that's already chosen for you, right? So in this example, we have natural language. So what does China censor online, right? So this is a so-called tag cloud, right? And it's in the shape of China. And then you can interactively choose an area that you're interested in or a topic that you're interested in to find out how it's censored, right? So Figueres introduced tooltips that pop up when a user clicks on one region and provides a more detailed set of information, right? And that's what that looks like. So it's an interactive visual representation of a narrative. And here's one that's what a visual representation of a narrative in parallel. So each polyline in this graph represents a story. In this case, it's a political story, right? 4 US presidential candidates from the 1st of January to the 26th of March 2008. So the x-axis represents time, and then the y-axis represents the number of times that the presidential candidates are mentioned, right? For example, Obama is mentioned many, many times here in this so-called story, right? Time passes along the x-axis for each candidate, the number of mentions of the term along the y-axis, right? So these are several stories about political candidates and how they're reported in the media over time, right? And we see that happening in parallel, right? And you can see that one candidate gets a lot more mentions than all the other ones. Okay, so those are some examples of narrative visual representations. So we went from the authoring tools, we started with the authoring tools, that we went to the narrative visualization topic, and now we're going into the transitions. So transitions are a special subtopic in the literature, right? And remember, they have these two subcategories, the static transitions. So there's just one event and then the next event, and then there are animated transitions. And there's a lot of study in the literature about static transitions versus animated transitions, and what are the benefits of animated transitions. If you noticed, when you use your Mac or your Windows interface, the transitions are usually animated. If you can see a transition, it's much more comprehensible, generally speaking, than if you can't see it. Like there's no transition between images, right? If there's no transition between images, do you know why it's confusing? Does anybody know why that can be confusing? Any guesses? It's because, like, if you just look away for a second or you blink and something changes, then you don't even know what happens, right? So that's why static transitions can be very confusing, right? So a transition refers to the process or a period of changing from one state or condition to another, right? I think that's something everybody can understand. There's not much problem with the definition there. There are no ambiguities as far as I know. So in visualization literature, transitions are static or dynamic. This is also a popular topic in HCI, like the core topic of HCI and user interfaces, right? And transitions are an important part of a narrative visual storytelling, right? Has anybody heard of Hans Rosling? So Hans Rosling is a famous statistician, or let's say was a famous statistician from Sweden. If you haven't heard of him, I think it's great to know about him, actually. And he's very good at representing statistics using visual form. And he's probably the world's most famous statistician. I think it's safe to say that. And he has a YouTube video that's got, I don't know how many, 100 million views or something. And what he has is a projection. On the x-axis is time. Is that true? Throughout the time frame. And then each bubble it represents a country, and then the y-axis is locations throughout the time. And what he's showing is mortality over time based on country. And in his narrative visualization, it's animated. You can see the bubbles as they move over time across space and time. And you can see, for example, the mortality of China as it starts very high and then decreases over time, for example. And he's using animated transitions. And it's a very, very famous narrative. It's probably the most famous statistical narrative in the history of mankind. And the reason it's so famous is because, well, firstly, it's visual, so the visual representation is really high quality. But then he's adding his voice on top of it, and it's very passionate. He's saying, like, look at what happens to China from 1900 to 2000, and the mortality rate is changing, and so on. So that's an example of an animated transition for stories in parallel, where each story is represented by a country and its mortality. And this paper is about changing that animated transition and turning it into a static representation. So instead of watching a bubble as it moves over time in an animation, we track the path of each country over time in a static representation. So life expectancy is mapped to the x-axis, infant mortality is mapped to the y-axis. So as time passes, infant mortality decreases, and then population is mapped to bubble size, and continent is mapped to color. And there's been a lot of study about, okay, what is more effective, representing these transitions in an animated way or in a static way where we can see the edges? Anybody want to guess what the answer is, by the way, in that case? So if you can represent transitions using animation in a graph or static in a graph like this? Anybody want to guess like what's more effective? It's okay to just guess and be incorrect. You have a 50-50 chance. Musa, what do you think?
I missed
The question?
Yeah.
That's why I called.
Yeah.
Anybody want to help her out?
I'd go with animations.
Animated transitions. Anybody else for animated transitions? Everybody else is for static. Well, the answer is both are correct. That's a trick question, actually. So animated transitions are very good for increasing user engagement. If you want to wake the audience up, right, like in Buza's case, then you would use animated transitions. If I was showing the animated version of this, Buza would be awake. She'd be like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. So in that case, the animated transitions are better, but in the case that you want to actually analyze the data, then the static representations are going to be better. So analyzing means like comparing two countries or trying to formulate a hypothesis and then confirm or refute the hypothesis and so on. Okay, there's obviously work in animated transitions for storytelling. In this case, the storytelling is linear. And in this example, we start with a scatter plot, and then we design an animated transition to turn it into a bar chart. Right? This is not the animated transition, but this is that animated transition represented in a static slide. Right? And we can go the other way, too, where the bar chart evolves into a scatter plot. Right? So there are some people that work on these animated transitions to increase the user understanding of different visual representations. Okay, good. So this is just a little summary of the future research directions. So these are unsolved problems in this area. This is an immature area. It's really still at the beginning in terms of from a visualization perspective. And here are some, if you're looking for unsolved problems, like what could I work on? Objective measures of user engagement is certainly not a solved problem. So how do you measure user engagement? And once you've decided how to measure it, how can you measure it objectively? Right? Using a measuring instrument that you can compare amongst multiple people. Somebody had that, so yeah, Buza, that was a little bit related to your dream data, like measuring people's reaction to events, external events like graduation. It's a similar theme, actually. So what we didn't mention here is data preparation and enhancement. Behind all of these visual representations of a story is a data set. And then the question is, how do you represent the stories using in a data, which data format do you use, for example? Right, that's an unsolved problem. We saw the big gaps in the table, right? There were big holes. One of them was narrative visualization for scientific and geospatial visualization, right? Unsolved problems. Memorability, how to make your visual representations as memorable as possible, is an unsolved problem. There is some work on that, but it's still not considered solved. Optimizing animated transitions for scientific and geospatial viz, and then measuring interpretation. You could also call that visualization literacy, right? Developing visualization literacy for scientific and geospatial visualization. Those are some of the unsolved and future research directions. This is a little overview of some of the different visual representations that have been studied in this context, right? So these are all the visual representations, and then these are all the papers on the y-axis. This is a zoomed-in view of the x-axis. And you can see that there are many visual designs missing here, like tree maps and parallel coordinates, matrix charts, glyphs. But there's a lot missing, actually. And I show this because these are some unsolved problems, right? Unsolved research directions. Any questions about that brief overview of visualization and storytelling? It's an advanced topic, so it's not easy to absorb. Anna?
Yeah. Maybe a very, very general question. Can you apply storytelling to any kind of data?
To any kind of data? I think you could apply storytelling to any kind of data, but like one component of that is you have to have an ordering, generally speaking. Like somehow you have to order the data, like something comes before something else. Sometimes there's a natural ordering, which is time, but if you don't have that time component, then you have to think, okay, what ordering makes sense? As long as you can think of an ordering, then I think it's possible. Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be time, right?
It doesn't have to be time.
Before that there's always a time component. But
A common ordering is something like size. You know, like you can see a lot of kind of visual representations of like the solar system, starting with the smallest planet up to the sun, right? And it's usually starting with the smallest, and then one after the other, the planets increase, right, until you get to the sun, and you see like the sun is like this, and then the earth is like this. You know, that's like a visual story where the order is not depending on time, but something else, like size or some other property. You know, importance could be another one, like least important to the most important sort of thing. Yeah. Another question?
Yeah, I have a question. In sort of like contemporary museums, you see a lot of these projects that want to make data accessible to a general public outside of academia, or like making research accessible, making science accessible.
Yes.
There's a lot of interactive data storytelling with like installations for children that they can move a button and you see like the data points flying around. So
Yes.
I mean, given this is a large survey paper, I was just wondering how this kind of work fits into your research.
Yes, that's a great question, actually. There is a special set of visualization literature that I would call visualization in the wild. So that means you take some visual representation of data and you put it in a setting that exposes it to the general public. And the museum is the classical example of that. And in fact, I just reviewed a paper that did the same, that did this this experiment. And I think there are a few let's say aspects that are really challenging. One is the understanding. So if you're a visitor and you come across one of these exhibitions, and I've come across them too, I notice that I don't want to spend much time and effort trying to understand it. You know what I mean? Like the more time and effort you need to understand it, the worse. If it takes 10 minutes to figure it out, the engagement is not going to be very good. If it takes 10 seconds to figure it out, then it's going to be more engaging, right? So my personal opinion, this is more like a personal opinion, is for such an exhibition, you need an automatic pilot sort of mode where the user doesn't have to really figure out anything. They just sit there and like a movie, they can watch it play, right, automatically without you having to figure it out. And then there can be kind of a mode that says, do you want to interact? And then you can go into an interactive setting where you actually control the parameters of the visual representation, if you know what I mean. So it has to be really easy. But like an example that I always use for some reason, I guess I'm just culturally conditioned. The example that I always think of is Pac-Man. Everybody know Pac-Man? Like if you see Pac-Man, the game, you see it's on autopilot, right? There's that guy, the character chasing the ghosts, eating the food and all that stuff. And it's in autopilot by default. You watch it for 10 seconds and you know exactly how it works. And you can immediately start playing. You don't need any instructions. It's got 4 directions. It's perfect. It's like the perfect user interface. So that's like the model to aspire to, in my opinion. Of course, Pac-Man's not that exciting, but I always think of it as like the perfect user interface. You got the autopilot mode, you watch it for 10 seconds, and you know how to play the game, and you can immediately start playing. You don't need any instructions or anything. So like that's the ideal case for these exhibitions too. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. I think part of my question is also that you're sort of thinking about how to tell a story with existing data. I feel in a museum situation, oftentimes the story is the more important thing than the data. My suspicion is always that the data is like skewed or distorted just to fit the story that they actually want to tell, and that only a certain range of the data is looked at. And in terms of how they do that, I think animation is always used because it looks cool.
Yeah.
But then often the data is too boring. So I'm also saying this because I'm currently working on one of these museum projects. I'm trying to understand what to do with it, because data in itself is not really interesting. Like, how can you produce an experience design for an audience without actually distorting the data?
Yeah, there's a bias, there's an implicit bias in there. If you're choosing a path through the data, somebody has to choose it, and that induces bias, right? Mm-hmm. And there are ways to make that objective, like in visualization. So like to make it objective, you would, arguably it's not 100% objective, but you can design an algorithm that selects the subsets of the data rather than a person. So an algorithm should be more objective than a person. So something that's fully automatic that says, okay, show me all the areas of local minima, for example, and that will show you features that a person might overlook, right? A person already has this idea in their head of where to look and what to look for that might be interesting. But if you make it fully objective and say, show me all the local maxima, that will be something that a person might not do. Or show me the average value in all of this space and time, something like this. Things like that. You can set out objective criteria that try to reduce or remove the bias, Another case could be like you have a slider, and the slider is mapped to value. You have a minimum value and a maximum value, and the user can choose anywhere in the range to look at, completely objectively. They can just take the slider, start from the minimum value, and slide to the maximum value, and get an overview of all the values objectively, without leaving out some by accident or focusing on some too much, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions like this? Everybody ready for the next exercise? You were about to ask, what's the next exercise?
Actually, I was going to ask you, could you suggest a software for like non-expert users to experiment with data visualization, to start somewhere?
Yes, yes. One place to start is just with Excel. Have you used Excel?
Generally, yeah.
So the reason I suggest that is because a lot of people are familiar with it already. You know, in Google Sheets. And if you look in there in Google Sheets or Excel, there's a lot of advanced stuff in there nowadays, actually. Not a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are advanced visual representations that people don't normally look at and explore. It's not just pie charts and bar charts anymore. There are other things in there. Another one is called Tableau. Tableau is really, really popular. And that has a lot of advanced visual stuff. And in my YouTube channel, I have tutorials on Tableau where we just sit down in a lab and we walk through step by step, like how to use Tableau. And it's literally like step 1, go to this URL and download the data. Like it's literally step by step. Like what button to press, start here, press this button, and so on. Any other questions? The problem with Tableau is the spelling. It's annoying to spell. Whoever decided that made a mistake with the spelling thing. There's a French word that has three vowels in a row, and it's hard to get the vowels in the right order. Okay, so exercise 3. Wow, we're running out of time actually. So we'll have to do this one kind of quickly. So the idea is to actually sketch a visual representation of your data with some pencil and paper and so on. I actually brought pencils and paper to try to sketch. I think we're not going to really have that much time. It's not as much time as I thought. So this, if you could pass that around. Okay. So taking that dream data set that you found and then trying to imagine what it would look like. And I brought some pencils, actually. This is the most difficult part, right, this exercise. I'm trying to think of what it could look like. This is just using your imagination, like what could your data look like if you were to represent it visually. Pass these around. You don't have to use those colored pencils, by the way. You can just use a pen or something. So form groups of 2 to 3. Sketch out a visual representation of your dream data. If you want inspiration and you've never done an exercise like this, you can Google Dear Data and then click on Images. So I can do that right now. Dear Data. And then I click on Images. And there are lots and lots of drawings, sketches, hand-drawn sketches of different data sets. Yeah. That you can use for inspiration.